It's Wednesday night, and thanks for accommodating the later in the week learning opportunity. And we are close to the end of Chumash B'Midbar, which means we're close to the end of our Parshat Shavua learning year, since we take Devarim off for the summer, even though the Torah keeps going. But I hope we'll find good opportunities to continue encountering the Parsha on its own. And of course, I am in the process of picking out who will be our repeat, um, our returning study partners, and who we will try out for the first time for next year. So if you have any feedback or requests, feel free to send them to me this week, or feel free to mention them at the end of our learning or post them in the chat. I'm always open to ideas. I definitely think I want to do Rabbi Foreman again, maybe for Breshit, although not decided yet, and explore some new recommendations as well. So looking forward to thinking that through and welcoming your feedback as well. And we're going to get right into the essay on this week's double parsha, Chukat-Balak, looking at the essay on Balak, which is rather long, and we're going to do a little bit of skimming. And one of the nice things about this essay is that Rabbi Foreman kind of lays out what the intertextual conversation is going to be right at the outset by titling the essay Bilam and the Akedah. So we already know what stories are going to be in conversation. So we don't have to go as much through the opening part in which he tries to, help us get there. So we'll just skim his opening questions and try to dive right into his comparison, his textual comparison. And then, as we've seen him do, he really tries to draw out what's behind the comparison, by trying to dive a little deeper into human experience, into our lived lives, and offer some takeaways for us. So here we go. Bilam and the Akedah. Again, I'm going to just do a little bit of sort of skimming at the outset. He points out a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, in which the sages talk about whoever possesses these three traits is mitalmidav shel Avraham Avinu, a disciple of Abraham. And then three other traits, which are the opposite, are mitalmidav shel Bilam Harasha, are considered to be the disciples of Bilam the wicked. And so we see this ostensible contrast between the two, and we got the list of traits. And his framing question, again, here he's starting from a rabbinic text. He's going to come to biblical texts and then go back to rabbinic texts to deepen the comparison or contrast. So it's a rabbinic text from Pirkei Avot that is our starting point. And the question is, who would have even ever thought to draw a line from Abraham to Bilam or vice versa? They seem to have so little in common that we would even come to neither a lot in common nor sort of an obvious basis to develop the contrasts. And he, goes through and tries to argue, the fact that they are mentioned in Pirkei Avot side by side means they must have some starting point, foundational basis of connection from which we want to highlight their differences. As he says, the sages seem convinced there's a basis for comparing these two men. What have they seen that you and I haven't seen yet? And then he points out also that in the comparison text, we're told three qualities are from the disciples of Abraham, and the other opposite three qualities are from the disciples of Bilam the wicked. And his second question is, why is Bilam called wicked? He doesn't seem on the face of it in the text itself to be so wicked. He keeps saying, I can only do what God tells me to do. So what's the basis? We don't see a malevolence in his nature. So what's the basis for calling him wicked? So those two questions, he says, will occupy us for the balance of the essay. If we can answer the first question, why do the sages contrast Abraham and Bilam in the first place? It'll put us in position to answer the second, what convinced the sages of Bilam's great evil? Okay, so for the first question, right, what's the starting point for this connection, off of which we then develop the difference between Abraham and Bilam? He says, I want to suggest to you that the sages are actually building off of a close reading of the biblical text. When reading the story of Bilam, they saw things that persistently reminded them of Abraham of all people. After enough of these cues accumulated, they became convinced that the Torah itself saw Bilam as an Abraham-like figure. What did they see? So we start off with, at the beginning of the Bilam story, Bilam finds himself accosted by messengers of Balak, king of Moab, who are seeking to gain Bilam's consent to leave home and go on a journey to aid the king. The messengers relay words of Balak that are full of praise for Bilam. And here's what Balak says: Ki yadati et asher tevarech mevorach, v'asher ta'or yu'al. I know that those whom you bless will be blessed, and those whom you curse will be cursed. And he says, well, that phraseology sure sounds familiar, doesn't it? It reminds us of God's reassuring words to Abraham. It's as if the beginning of the Bilam story matches up with the beginning of the Abraham story. In a way, in the Abraham story, God is doing a version of what Balak would later do. God is a heavenly king asking someone to leave home and go on a journey to be of service to God. And in this context, the Almighty speaks of blessing and curses, just as Balak, this earthly king, will later do. As it says, going back to Lech Lecha, Va'abarcha mevarechecha, Imkalelcha a'or, I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse. In both cases, our protagonists, Abraham in one case, Bilam in the other, seem to be the source of special blessings and curses that can and will affect others. Even the language the Torah uses to describe Bilam's capacity with curses and blessings seems to mirror the language we find with Abraham. In each case, the word for blessing appears twice, as does the word for curse. And we see the side-by-side comparison. Abraham in Lech Lecha, Va'abarcha mevarechecha u'mekalelcha a'or, and Bilam, ki yadati et asher tavarech mevorach, that's the double blessing in blue, ve'et asher ta'or yu'ar, the double curse in green. We find here the beginnings for a basis of comparison between the two biblical figures. It should be noted, by the way, and he doesn't go into this, but the ki yadati I was thinking about that Balak says about Bilam, now I know, or I know that this is true about you. I haven't gone to do a search about this, but the ki yadati strikes me as a not very, very common phrase. And I think we find it twice in the story of God's relationship with Abraham. When God decides to get Abraham's point of view, talk to Abraham about the destruction of Sodom, God says, ki yadativ I have known about Abraham that he is someone who will instruct his family in the way of God to do righteousness and justice. And later at the Akedah, it says, Ataya dati ki yirei Elokim ata, something like that. Now I know. So I think the ki yadati, although Rabbi Foreman doesn't pick it up here, is also a strong point of textual comparison between the Bilam story and the Abraham story in terms of the other character, Balak the king, God the king, and their knowledge about the other being a strong connection. I have to search up how frequently ki yadati shows up, but I think it's another connection. It should be noted, by the way, that for all the similarities in language here, the text also creates a powerful contrast between Abraham and Bilam. These two people are very emphatically not doing the same thing. In the case of Bilam, we're told that Bilam is the one who bestows blessings and curses. Bilam is active. However, in Abraham's case, he is passive. It's not he who bestows the blessings, rather it's God. So while the biblical language seems to link these two men, it also at the same time presents them as kind of inverses of one another, just as we find the sages doing in the Mishnah. But that's only the beginning. There's more. So that's a first link between Bilam and Abraham, but it's not the last. For as it turns out, the heavenly king, God, asked Abraham to go on two great journeys. One at the beginning of his story, right when we're first introduced to him. One at the end. In fact, many commentaries that talk about the 10 tests of Abraham talk about these as the bookends. The first journey was to the land of Canaan. The second was to Mount Moriah, where he was asked to offer up his son Yitzchak in the story we now know as the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And wouldn't you know it, typical Rabbi Foreman, wouldn't you know it, the parallels between Bilam and Abraham seem to link Bilam's journey not just to Abraham's first journey, right? That's what we saw before about those who you bless, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. That's from Abraham's first journey. But the parallels connect not just to Abraham's first journey, but to his second one as well. Consider, for example, these words which describe how Bilam prepared himself to travel at Balak's behest. Bilam woke up in the morning, Vayakam Bilam baboker, Vayachabo shetatono, and saddled his mule. Does that remind you of anything perchance in the Abraham narrative? Okay, we'll jump to the box. We have Vayashkem Abraham baboker. Avram got up early in the morning. Vayachabo shetchamolo, and saddled his donkey. Slightly different animal, maybe slightly different amount of earliness in the morning. Waking up in the morning, saddling the animal to go for the journey is the common point. Moreover, we often forget a little detail about Bilam's story, but it's there. When he went on his journey, he took two lads with him, just as Abraham once did. Right in the Akedah story, Vayikach et shnei na'arav ito, Avram took his two lads with him, and Bilam went riding on his mule, ushnei na'arav imo, with his two lads with him. And dear reader, lest you are tempted to chalk all this up to coincidence, know that the parallels between the men and their respective journeys continue still further, right? Because we could always say, you go on a journey, you take your two lads with you. Why is that so out of the ordinary? Even though I don't think there are many biblical journeys, very few of them mention the two lads, but still. Consider, for example, the role that angels play in Abraham and Bilam's respective travels. After God grants Bilam permission to travel with Balak's messengers and Bilam sets off on his journey, an angel comes and blocks his way. We know that verse, the angel blocks the way in the narrow path. Well, in the story of the binding of Isaac, an angel showed up at a crucial moment too. God commanded Abraham to take Yitzchak and offer him up as an offering, but then an angel of God came along and blocked that outcome from actually occurring. Here are the two side by side, right? So an angel of God called out to Abraham, don't send your hand against the boy and don't do anything to him. And the angel of God again moved forward and stood blocking his way in a narrow path where there was no room to turn left or right or left, right? So we have the angels blocking the fulfillment of the mission. Again, one, a mission to curse sent by a human king, one, a mission to sacrifice your child sent by the divine king. But still, fundamentally, structurally, they line up. And we see as the colors are laid out here that the parallels also are organized in the same order of the stories. So that as you read through the stories of the journeys to the Akedah and to the mission of cursing the Jewish people side by side, you hear the echoes of one story and the other. In light of these parallels, drawing comparisons between Bilam and Abraham, as the Mishnah does, is starting to feel not quite as odd. Sorry, my video froze for a moment. It feels like the Torah itself is trying to connect these two figures. The question, though, is why? What about these two men bears comparison to one another? A clue, perhaps, comes from the point of contact here. Most of the parallels we have seen between Bilam and Abraham seem to revolve around journeys. For Abraham, there were two journeys, and for Bilam, only one. But in each case, there were journeys. Again, sorry if my video is being a little choppy tonight. Intriguingly, in the case of Abraham, although one journey to Canaan happens at the beginning of his story, and the other to go offer up his son as an offering occurs at the end, each comes with a directive from God that is almost exactly the same. This may be a familiar comparison to some of us. God's instruction to Abraham in Parshat Lech Lecha is, and God said to Abraham, Lech Lecha me'artzecha mimoladatecha mibeit avicha el ha'aretz asher areka. Go, Lech Lecha, from your land, etc., to the land that I will show you. And 10 chapters later, when God tells Abraham to take Yitzchak, God says, take your son, your only son that you love. That's Yitzchak, Lech Lecha, el eretz ha-Moriah, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him as an offering. The similarity in language invites us to think of the second journey as an extension of the first. Reading these two stories together confirms the truth of this connection. In the first story, Abraham is asked to leave his home, his birthplace, and his father's house behind. In the second story, he's being asked to give his child, Yitzchak, back to God. In the first story, Abraham is asked to leave behind everything that ties him with his past. In the second story, he is asked, this is a kind of a wild phrase, to leave behind his future. Right? So now Rabbi Foreman, a little complex, is doing something interesting. He's taking two biblical stories from the same person's life, Abraham, looking at their textual parallels, the Lech Lecha and the Artzecha, sort of collapsing them into one, the bookend journeys of Abraham's life, and then comparing that merged journey with Bilam's journey. In any case, if Abraham is somehow to be seen as on one long journey, a journey which culminates with his trek up the mountain with Yitzchak, it would seem that Bilam's journey up a mountain in his case to curse the Israelites, is meant to be seen by the reader as running parallel somehow to Abraham's journey. But the question again is why? The Torah seems to be telling us that Bilam is on an Akedah-like journey. But what about his mission was Akedah-like? Okay, so that's really the textual parallels. Now Rabbi Foreman is going to try to dive pretty deep into his analysis here. Well, Abraham was being tested in the Akedah. Perhaps the Torah is suggesting that Bilam was undergoing some sort of test too. But a test of what? To wrap up our minds around this question, I think we need to return to the story of the Akedah and try to understand the nature of the test it imposed on Abraham. On an overt level, we might say that the test was, will Abraham give up what is most precious to him and thereby prove his fealty to God? But on a deeper level, it seems to me there was another test, a more basic one. The demand God is making of Abraham is unsettling. Abraham waited a lifetime for a child, and now unimaginably God wants Abraham to take a knife to him to send that child back to God in heaven. Every fiber in Abraham's being must have wanted to rebel against that command. Imagine God instructed you to do something you desperately did not want to do. What exactly would be the nature of this test? The obvious answer is that what's the nature of the test? Would you do it or not? And yes, at face value, that's certainly true. But I think you would also be faced with a more subtle and even more basic test. Would you even allow yourself to fully and accurately hear those instructions in the first place? By way of explanation, now we're getting into sort of the heart of his argument and the sort of psychological read here. By way of explanation, allow me to share a midrashic teaching with you. It's a story the sages tell about the Akedah, and I suspect that the point of their little story is to illustrate the idea that I'm suggesting here. Again, now we're getting into his deeper analysis, so we've moved away from the shot, plain sense textual parallels, and now we're doing a deeper dive through the rabbinic, portal into an analysis of the Akedah story and what the nature of the test is, in order to then be able to come back and get a deeper understanding of the Bilam story because of the connection to the Akedah story. The midrash I want to point you to imagines a conversation, so to speak, that God has with Abraham at the beginning of the Akedah story. In the biblical text itself, of course, God does have a conversation with Abraham at this point in the story, but since God does all the talking, it hardly merits being a conversation at all. God says to Abraham, please take Kachna et bincha, your son, et Yechidcha, the only one, Asher Ahavta, whom you love, Yitzchak, and go. We have that Lech Lecha parallel to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as an offering, or bring him up there as a elevation. But the Midrash, this is a Midrash there on the Akedah, Tanhuma Vayera 22, fleshes out the conversation and imagines that at each descriptive phrase, Rashi quotes this, Abraham offered a response. For example, when God said to Abraham, take your son, Abraham replied, which son would you like me to take? After all, Abraham had two sons, Yitzchak and Yishmael. To this, God replied, your only son, Yechidcha. But Abraham persisted, protesting each is the only son to his mother. And so God clarified the request further, the one that you love, Asher Ahavta. At that point, Abraham responded, but I love them both. And finally, the master of the universe gave the ultimate clarification, Yitzchak. The sense we get from the Midrash is that Abraham is almost playing a game with God. He seems to know deep down whom God is referring to, that God wants him to offer up Yitzchak, but he doesn't like the answer. He doesn't want God to be talking about Yitzchak. And so he engages in what amounts to a desperate back and forth, seeking to forestall somehow the inevitable conclusion. Indeed, as we read the rest of the Midrash, the sages seem to amplify this theme. They go on to relate other conversations one might imagine that Abraham as well as Yitzchak might have had on the way to the mountain to carry out the Akedah. Only this time, their interlocutor was not God, but Satan. The Midrash suggests that Satan appeared to Abraham in the guise of an old man and struck up a conversation with him. The conversation quickly progressed from mere small talk to more weighty matters. The disguised Satan asks Abraham where he happens to be going. Evasively, Abraham responds that he's going to pray to God. But the old man won't let Abraham alone. He points out, by the way, it's interesting, we don't have the whole Midrash in front of us, but the idea that Abraham answers he's going to pray is also interesting for the kind of prehistory of the idea that sacrifice and prayer are interconnected, because the plain sense of the text is that Abraham is going to offer up a burnt offering. But when the Satan says, what are you going to do? Abraham says, pray. So there's just another rabbinic link there between sacrifice and prayer. But the old man won't let Abraham alone. He points out all the accoutrements that Abraham has with him, and he slyly inquires about them. Really? You're only going to pray? Someone going to pray, Misha holech palel, for what do they need fire and a knife in their hand and wood on their shoulder? Again, Abraham responds evasively, sure, I'm going to pray, but maybe I'll stick around on the top of the mountain for a day or two where we'll slaughter an animal, bake some food, and eat it. Right? It's like a camping trip with some davening. Having forced Abraham into ever more strained evasions of the real truth, the Satan sees his opening and pounces. He said to him, Zakain, old man, Lo Sham Hayiti, wasn't I there when God said to you, take your only son, or take your son? Zakein kamotcha yelech v'yabeid ben shenitan lo lamea shana. An old man like you is really going to go destroy the son finally given to him at the age of 100? In the sage's narrative, Satan then plays the ultimate mind game with Abraham. He attempts to confuse Abraham about who it was who issued the decree to take Isaac up that mountain and offer him as a sacrifice. He attempts to suggest to Abraham that it wasn't God who issued that command, but Satan. Perhaps you think that once you kill Yitzhak, you'll have another son. But don't delude yourself with that thought. You must have been talking to a Satan, a seducer, because in reality, one who murders someone is liable to be killed. To this, Abram replies, it wasn't a seducer, a Satan talking to me. It was God's own self. So I'm not going to listen to you. Abram ultimately rebuffs Satan. But to do so, he needs to play a confusing game of who's who with the old man who accosts him. He needs to keep straight the fact that it was God, not Satan, who instructed him to offer Yitzchak up on the mountain. A task made harder by the fact that Abraham is, at this very moment, in discussion with someone who is actually Satan in disguise. Kind of incredible midrash. Finding no luck in seducing Abraham with lies, Satan, according to the midrash, tries his luck with Yitzchak instead. This time he appears in the guise of a strapping young lad and begins again with the same innocent question. Continuing in the midrash, the Satan, now appearing like a young man, says to Yitzchak, where are you going? Yitzchak also says, I'm going to learn Torah. Different item on the rabbinic to-do list, not davening, but learning. To this, Satan replies with the same sardonic wit he used with Abraham. Really, you're going to learn Torah while you're alive or while you're dead? Then, having softened Yitzchak up, Satan moves in for the kill. He appeals to Yitzchak's sense of compassion for his own mother. Oh, unfortunate son of an unfortunate mother, how many fasts did your mother fast until you were born? And now this old man has gone crazy and is going to slaughter you. But Yitzchak too withstands Satan's challenge. He answers the young man standing beside him this way. Yitzchak said, Af al pichein, even so, lo e'evor al dat yotzri v'al tzivoy avi. I will not violate the command, the will of my creator, nor the command of my father. What did the sages want us to understand by telling us about these elaborate and somewhat fantastical discussions Abraham and Yitzchak had on their way to the Akedah? I think the answer can be gleaned if we ask ourselves a deceptively simple question. Who exactly is Satan? I'm sorry, Lance is not here. He's a big fan of Satan, so to speak, but he's got some other projects occupying him over the continuation of the summer. So who exactly is Satan? In the popular imagination, Satan conjures images of pitchforks and bright red suits. But to understand what the Midrash means by Satan, I think you need to look a little more carefully at his disguises. When Satan stops Abraham, he's dressed up as an old man. But then when he moves on to Yitzchak, he appears as a strapping young lad. Clearly, he's taking on the appearance of the one he's talking to. Isaac is a strapping young lad, while Abraham is a wizened old man. So Satan looks like each in turn when he talks to them. Why? Because in the eyes of the Midrash, what Satan really is, what this great opposing force that causes us to come to sin in our lives really comes down to, is a part of ourselves, namely our fears. Indeed, such a view of Satan would seem to have a precedent. A similar view of Satan seems to emerge from another well-known midrash that speaks to us about the events leading up to the golden calf. The biblical text tells us that when Moshe was delayed coming down from Mount Sinai, the people asked Aaron to make a god for them because this man, Moshe, we have no idea what became of him. In explanation, Rashi cites a midrashic teaching that Satan surreptitiously showed the Israelites an image of a dead Moshe atop the mountain. Again, the sages seem to be using the idea of Satan as a way of talking about our deepest fears, what can be seen as our ultimate internal catalyst to sin. The people feared Moshe would die atop the mountain. After all, that's why they sent Moshe in the first place. As the Torah itself attests, they were too afraid to speak to God directly, fearing that any mortal man would die if they encountered the divine. In suggesting that Satan showed the people an image of a dead Moshe in heaven, the sages seem to be saying that the catalyst for the people's worship of the calf was their fear that a human could not withstand the encounter with God. In the absence of a human who could make the connection for them, they sought something akin to a machine, a god of their own making, who could represent them in an encounter with the Almighty and who could not be killed. Okay, we're put most of the pieces in place to drill down on our analysis. To return to the sages' discussion of Satan with respect to Abraham and Yitzchak, I would surmise that Satan appears differently to Abraham and Yitzchak because they each have their own set of dreaded fears. The way the Midrash talks about Abraham's internal struggle with those fears is in terms of a conversation with himself. Abraham sees what amounts to a reflection of himself, an externalization of his fears, and has a conversation, so to speak, with those fears. He is, in fact, an old man who waited, hoped, and prayed for a child for 100 years, who desperately wishes for that child to survive and carry on his legacy. So how will he deal with that? What would Yitzchak's deepest fear be? The Midrash surmises it might be that his father has perhaps lost his mind. Would God really tell him to sacrifice me? And so, in entertaining those fears, the Midrash portrays Yitzchak as having a discussion with a mirror image of himself. For both Yitzchak and Abraham, their real test, the Midrash suggests, is how they will deal with their fears. In each case, fear wants them to believe that the command God has issued is not in fact real, that Abraham didn't hear from God when in fact he heard. Were Abraham or Yitzchak to give in to Satan, each would be giving in to the part of themselves that wants to believe that reality is other than it is. Each would be capitulating to a convenient but patently false illusion foisted upon them by none other than themselves. All told, the Midrash suggests that the test Abraham must pass is a more subtle one than we might have supposed. Before Abraham must decide whether to comply with God's command to offer up his son, he must actually believe the truth of the command in the first place. He must acknowledge the terribly inconvenient truth of what is really being asked of him. It would be so very convenient for Abraham to imagine that the command to give Yitzchak back to heaven was issued by an impostor. Abraham's ultimate challenge is to keep himself anchored, despite all his fears, hopes, and desires, to what he knows is the awful truth. This is absolutely God's message. Every fiber of my being wants to deny that, but I will acknowledge this to be true and will faithfully carry out what God is asking of me. We are in a position now, I think, to go back to our original questions about Bilam and Abraham, and to understand why the sages and the biblical text itself seemed to nudge us into thinking that Bilam made his own Akedah-like journey, right? Remember all the way back by the Midrash in Pirkei Avot, comparing the disciples of Abraham to the disciples of Bilam the wicked. And we asked, what's the basis for the comparison? We found the textual links between the stories. The links were between Abraham's journeys, in particular, his clothing journey onto the Akedah, with Bilam's journey to curse Bnei Israel. And so we wanted to say, clearly there's a basis for comparison, even though ultimately they're opposites. But what can we learn from that basis of comparison? And we delve deeper into the Akedah story to say that the challenge of the Akedah was not even, will Abraham do it, but will Abraham acknowledge the real thing God is asking of him. It may well be that deep down, Bilam struggled with a very similar test to Abraham's. Yes, of course, Bilam obeys whatever he allows himself to hear God saying to him. But that's not the same as saying he obeys whatever God in fact says to him. The question is, to what extent is Bilam willing to lie to himself? To see how this Akedah-like struggle plays out for Bilam, consider the beginning of the story, where the Torah details a curious series of exchanges between Balak and Bilam. Balak sends messengers to Bilam seeking to recruit him to curse the Israelites. We're now doing one more close reading, not a comparison, although there'll be a little comparison, but mostly just a close reading of this, slightly next stage or earlier stage in the Parsha. Balak sends messengers to Bilam seeking to recruit him to curse the Israelites. Bilam tells them to spend the night so he can confer with God. And God, right on cue, comes to Bilam with a set of instructions. Don't go with them. Don't curse the nation because it's blessed. Please take a moment to reread those words, and as you do, ask yourself, has God been clear to Bilam about God's wishes, or has God been ambiguous? The Almighty really didn't leave Bilam that much wiggle room there. God has said no in every conceivable way you can imagine. Don't go with them. Don't curse the nation. They are blessed. It's hard to see any room for argument. But listen to how Bilam communicates God's words back to Balak. And I think this is subtle, and I don't think it's the only way to read this text, but it's still, it's a Rabbi Foreman insight. It has to be taken seriously. But listen to how Bilam communicates God's words back to Balak. He wakes up in the morning, goes to the messengers of Balak, and tells them, go back to your land. Lots, by the way, more going and land, but that's just, part of this discussion. Go back to your land. Because God has, I would typically translate this as refused to give me, permission to go with you. But he translates, and he's going to defend why, translated as God has withheld God's self from allowing me to go with you. A little bit more passive and contorted sort of than just refusal. But that's his translation. Again, he'll defend it. Now, how accurate a reflection of God's words would you say that is? It's kind of accurate, meaning God had said, don't go with them, don't curse the nation because it's blessed. And Bilam says, God has withheld God's self from allowing me to go with you. Is that an accurate description of what God said? It's kind of accurate, but Bilam paints a much fuzzier picture of God's stance than we, the reader, have been given to understand. The most straightforward thing for Bilam to have done would be to explain to the messengers basically what God told him. Tell them God said no and why God said no. Namely, the mission is utterly futile. God said absolutely not. This whole plan of cursing the Israelites is never going to happen. They're just blessed. Go home. This is a waste of time. Not exactly biblical idiom, but that's the idea. Instead, though, Bilam fudges it. He says that God refused to let him go, and that's it. The implication is that he's been given no reason for the refusal, and perhaps no reason exists. God is being capricious, maybe even unfair. It's like when your friend asks you to come play and you come back with, my mom said no. Mom actually said, it's past your bedtime, you have homework for tomorrow, and you didn't do your chores. So while saying that mom said no is not technically inaccurate, it's not the whole story. Good illustration. Moreover, even the word for no in Bilam's telling is, well, telling. That word me'ain, which sometimes means refusal, often conveys a lingering sense of unresolved tension. A comparable use of the word that comes to mind is in the Yosef story, where Yosef mightily resists the attempts of Potiphar's wife to seduce him. Vayima'ain, vayomer el eshet adonav, hein adoni, lo yadayiti ma'babayit, etc., etc. He refused. He said to his master's wife, behold, my master gives everything over to me. There's no one in this house greater than I, and he did not keep anything from me except for you, because you are his wife. Me'ain doesn't just mean that Yosef refused her. The word suggests a kind of tormented holding oneself back. The inner struggle of Yosef also is conveyed by the cantillation markings in the text. When Yosef refuses, a shalshelet appears above the word vayima'ain. The shalshelet, is one of the rarest of all cantillation notes, and it conveys tonally, we've discussed this in other settings, the idea of wavering back and forth. Similarly, Bilam with his me'ain appears to be signaling to Balak's messengers that God was wavering. Yes, God may certainly have said no, but look, God was just holding God's self back. I suspect that perhaps God could be persuaded. And as it turns out, that implication is not lost on Balak's messengers, except that Balak's messengers may be able to perceive a truth about Bilam that Bilam himself is actually blind to. Right? Bilam is blind to various things in this story. Look at how they report Bilam's words back to Balak. The officers of Moab got up and came to Balak and said, Me'ain Bilam haloch imanu. Bilam has withheld himself from coming with us. Did you notice how that very word, me'ain, withhold oneself, meanders into their report? Only they don't use that word to describe God. They use it to describe Bilam. The messengers, this is a great reading, I think. The messengers seem to have discerned that when Bilam claimed that God withheld God's self, Bilam actually revealed more about his own state of mind than God's. It's as if they're telling Balak, sure, Bilam said no, but he may yet be persuaded. Okay. Perceiving that Bilam is vacillating, the king of Moab decides to try again, and this time he sweetens the pot. Balak again sent officers greater and more honorable than the others. They came to Bilam and said, "Thus says Balak ben Zippor, Al na timana, don't hold yourself back." This is a different verb, but same general idea, "from coming to me, because I will honor you greatly." And here's where something subtle happens. Bilam sees that Balak is looking to seduce him with a promise of honor and wealth. And he seems to respond by assuring the messengers that he can't be bought. His only allegiance is to God. But even in his rejection of Balak's entreaty, one detects the undercurrents of Bilam's own ambivalence. So much so that at some level, Bilam's rejection isn't so much a rejection as it is an invitation. In a way, this is kind of takes us back to last week also when we talked about the places where God's rejection was also an invitation. You know, when God says, "Separate yourself from this community and I will destroy them." And we understood that God was leaving open the possibility to not separate and therefore prevent God from destroying. So there's a little thread, between the previous Parsha in Korach and here, where we're sort of seeing an undercurrent or a between the lines reading of an otherwise straightforward intent. Yes, okay, so much so that at some level, Bilam's rejection isn't so much a rejection as it is an invitation. If Balak were to give me a whole house full of silver and gold, I cannot transgress that which God, my God, asks of me, not in a small way or a great way. So now wait here till tonight, and let's see what God will tell me again. Of course, it sure sounds righteous of Bilam to say he can't transgress what God says even in the slightest bit, but his mention of an entire house full of gold and silver does seem oddly explicit, almost as if this measure of wealth might be something, despite Bilam's denials, that he's actually angling for. And the real kicker is what Bilam says next. He tells the messengers to hang around another night because, look, who knows? Maybe the master of the universe will change God's mind, right? And it's like, sort of feel like after you read this paragraph, it's hard to unsee that in the story. You can sort of read through the story and say, okay, Bilam is saying, no matter what you give me, I will not go against God's will. And so, let's see what God has to say. And then you say, wait a minute, what does that mean? Let's see what God has to say. Sounds like he's, vacillating, hoping for a different outcome, considering, pitching for, well, maybe if you give me enough, I'll try to convince God to change God's mind. Tellingly, when Bilam does ask God again, surprisingly, God does change God's mind. The Almighty allows Bilam to go with the messengers with the caveat that once he arrives at the designated place, Bilam must absolutely say whatever God tells him and nothing else. At face value, that seems quite strange, but on second thought, maybe it's not so surprising after all. For remember, God had earlier made clear what God wanted, and Bilam had in return made clear that he wasn't prepared to accept the truth that this is what God actually wanted. Now you can hear the echoes of his analysis of Abraham, which is about, can you hear what the actual request is? Not so much will you do it or not. Can you hear what the actual request is? And so God chose to play along with that. If Bilam is going to ignore God's expressed desires, then so be it. Here's how we will play it. Go if you must, but you absolutely have to do what I say once you get there. Indeed, the Midrash derives from God's eventual choice to allow Bilam to go with the messengers a basic truth about the way the master of the universe chooses to interact with mankind. And that is, B'derech sha'adam rotzeh lelech, ba molichin oto. In the path that a person wants to walk, so heaven guides him. Getting back to Bilam's suggestion to the messengers that they stick around for the night to see what God will tell him, that supposition that perhaps God will change God's mind, that there are conflicting forces at play in God's nature, is more of a wish than anything else. But the important thing to notice is that Bilam doesn't recognize it as such. If you could go back in time and interview Bilam at this moment, he might well be offended by any suggestion that he was playing fast and loose with God's words. Didn't I tell those messengers that no matter how much money is on the table, I absolutely cannot contravene God's words? But it is precisely Bilam's smugness, his sense of his own incontrovertible righteousness, that makes him so vulnerable to self-delusion. Bilam blinds himself to the way that his own inner desires are manipulating his choices, and thus falls ever more deeply under their sway. I think there's a very rich nugget of psychological analysis. He tells the messengers to spend the night because maybe God will change God's mind, and in so doing, willfully ignores the truth of God's adamant opposition without ever being honest with himself that this is what he's doing. And it is here, I think, that we arrive at why the sages of the Mishnah were so willing to castigate Bilam as an evildoer. Remember, it was not just the comparison between Abram and Bilam, but the good attributes were described as the disciples of Abraham, and the bad attributes and opposite were described as the disciples of Bilam the wicked. And that second question was, what's so wicked about Bilam? What's so rasha about him? So now we arrive at why the sages of the Mishnah were so willing to castigate Bilam as an evildoer. He failed his own little version of an Akedah test. And how did he fail it? Through self-deception, right? He told himself, I really am following God's word and doing only what God would say, when really he was trying to get God to change God's mind or not really do what God would say. In the end, Bilam and Abraham really are playing in the same sandbox. Each undertakes a great journey in which they must go, bidden by God, to do something that stands in opposition to their greatest desires. Moreover, each has enough fealty to God that they would not even consider contravening God's words. But that's not their real struggle. Their real struggle is to admit that God's words really are what they are in the first place. If you can see the truth for what it is, despite your desperate desire for things to be otherwise, then you are an Abraham. If you are unable or unwilling to see that, you are a Bilam. Ironically, what makes Bilam's evil so dangerous is that he's so convinced of his righteousness. Yes, Bilam is right about the fact that he will not act against God's words, but only once he convinces himself that God is saying what God absolutely clearly is actually saying, which may never happen. And therein lies Bilam's losing struggle. Despite all evidence to the contrary, Bilam clings to the notion that God doesn't mean what God says God means, and that God is ambivalent, that God can be persuaded. And in so doing, Bilam projects upon God his own struggle with unseen desires. He crafts God in his own image. What proclivities push one toward the Bilam side of the ledger? And what tools does one need to cultivate to be an Avraham? The sages weren't shy about telling us. Now we return to our opening text that set us off on this journey of connection to begin with. Whoever possesses these three traits is a disciple of Avraham. Whoever possesses the opposite traits is a disciple of Bilam Harasha, the wicked. Ayin tova, ve'ruach nimucha, ve'nefesh shefela, a giving or good or generous eye, a humble spirit, and an unassuming soul. These are the qualities of one who has learned from Avraham. Ayin ra'a ve'ruach gvoha ve'nefesh rechava, a greedy eye, a haughty spirit, and a boastful soul. These are the qualities of one who has learned from Bilam the wicked. In the sage's view, the crucial Abrahamic character trait is humility. It allows for a certain kind of transparency in how one deals both with others and with oneself and one's own hidden desires and fears. Conversely, arrogance must be avoided at all costs because, look, if you're arrogant, ultimately everything is about you. This harkens back to, I can't remember which one it was in, maybe it was in Baha'alotran, the story of Moshe's, Aaron and Miriam speaking against Moshe, and that question of sort of, negation of the self or clearing out room in the self for the other, relates to this, are you full of yourself and don't have room, or are you humble and can you see that, there is truth outside of yourself? So conversely, arrogance must be avoided at all costs because, look, if you're arrogant, ultimately everything is about you. Moreover, arrogance is a double whammy. Not only does the arrogant person put a premium on fulfilling his own desires, he lacks the humility to see that this is what he's doing. Because he is convinced that his saintliness is beyond reproach, the arrogant person blinds himself to the unseen biases that shape his decisions. And therein lies the arrogant man's true susceptibility to evil, right? I think I like that phrasing of susceptibility to evil. It doesn't say, therefore, the arrogant man is evil, but is susceptible to evil. Because look, all of us have desires. We want what we want, and what we want isn't always what God wants. But it is one thing to have desires that may diverge from God's will and to face those desires squarely. A perfectly fine, honest, and even noble endeavor. And it is quite another thing not to admit that you have such desires in the first place. That's the dangerous part. Anyone who finds themselves at that end of Bilam and Avraham's sandbox, anybody who cloaks unseen desires in the mantle of pure self righteousness, is dangerously prone to acting with real unchecked malice. For once someone is convinced of their own saintliness, the last guardrails on their conduct, their recognition of the reality of their own fears and desires, have been gingerly plucked away. With this gone, their unknowing transformation into the ugly puppet of those hidden fears and desires will likely not be long in coming. So it's really the richness of his language, and the illustrative way of his painting this picture, I find very powerful and compelling. There's a poetry and a truth to it that I think just sort of speaks for itself. And I think, the first place my mind goes to this, with this has to do, I think, a lot with how we, read the Torah, read Jewish sources, interpret halacha. We have a tendency to, or we are challenged by a tendency to, interpret in light of our already held beliefs and read texts in light of our already held beliefs, and then we can present ourselves as loyal to the tradition when really we're just interpreting the tradition in light of the way we want it to be. And that's a very tricky, you know, it's not simple, to distill and kind of suss out those tendencies and correct against them. Um, but it's critical, at least, to try and to be self-aware of what biases shape our readings, and to be honest about whether those things really are there or not. And sometimes they're not there and we want them to be, and that's okay to say out loud, as he's saying. But we have to sort of acknowledge them. And sometimes we could say that we're not sure. But the framing, the idea, the underlying message, I find very, very resonant. And the way he reads it in with those close readings, I find very powerful. So um, I commend this essay to us for our consideration over this Shabbat. We have two whole parshas, Chukat and Balak, and this is really just one snippet of the Bilam story. But I think it's a very rich analysis. And when we come back around in our study of Pirkei Avot to this passage about Avraham and Bilam, we have, I think, a lot more depth to it. And of course, I wonder, in constructing this essay, did Rabbi Foreman start with this Mishnah and then go back to the text? Did it happen in the other direction? He was looking at the text, seeing the parallels, and then came across the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Who knows? But I think he also does a beautiful job here, as we've seen in a couple of essays now, of not just linking texts together from the Chumash, but then highlighting how those texts serve as a basis for rabbinic texts that are powerful and fascinating in their own terms, and then how those rabbinic texts can shed light back on the biblical text. Any questions, comments, or reactions? Yeah, Dad, great.
So I'm not sure if this relates to anything in these comparisons, but Avraham, it says Vayash came, and if I remember correctly, that is used when Shemuel is supposed to get up and tell Shaul, King Saul, that the monarchy is no longer to be his.
Mm,
And I think it says that Shmuel couldn't sleep that night. And
mm,
Vayash came means he just couldn't sleep and he had to get up early.
mm-hmm.
And that's what Abraham is doing. He couldn't sleep that night. And I don't think he wants to do what God has said to him to do.
Yes,
And
yes.
interestingly, Rashi comments on Vayash came that his running to do a
Yeah.
mitzvah.
Yeah.
And if you
Yeah.
look at what Abraham does next, he saddles his donkey. Well, he's 100 years old. He's got lads. He's a wealthy man. He's got plenty of people who can saddle his donkey, but he's doing it. So who knows how
Mm-hmm.
long that's going to take? And then he has to get his two lads. And then he's chopping wood for the sacrifice, for the fire. To me, instead of going to kill Isaac, he's killing time. He
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't want to do this
Yeah.
because afterwards it says Vayakum. He got up. It seems to me he was so busy and doing so many things that he fell asleep. And he finally gets up and goes along with the what he was told to do. But it's to me, it's he's not willing to do this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very, very possible. I remember this wonderful interpretation of yours over the years, and I'm glad you shared it here. And I think, what I think Rabbi Foreman would say to it is on this reading, he has no delusions or illusions about what God has asked him. He doesn't want to do it. He's hoping God will change God's mind in some way, but he's not attempting to change God's mind or lying to himself about what God has really instructed him. Whereas Bilam is telling himself, that God has said something God hasn't really said, or hasn't said something God really has said, and is sort of attempting to really change God's mind, or lie to himself about what God has said. And Abraham acknowledges that it really is what it is, and is just painful and schlepping himself about
Mm-hmm.
actually carrying it out.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great that Vayash game is definitely it's one of the differences between the Abraham and Bilam stories in that pasuk, and it's interesting to think about what that might be about.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I remember
yeah.
once Rabbi Wolberg gave a class on the Akedah, and he had these two sets of commentaries. One set was Abraham's on his way, he's going to do it. And the other set of commentaries, nope, he doesn't want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And these are
Mm-hmm.
all traditional, whatever, rabbinic, medieval commentaries.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. Um, yeah, as we are talking, I was just looking back to that point from before about the frequency of ki adati just shows up only 6 times in the Torah. One of them is God with Abraham, and one of them is here with Balak and Bilam. So I think there's also something to that comparison. Um, yeah. All right, the hour is late, so thank you so much to everybody. I think it's just a really wonderful essay to get to read together. I'm just noting that next week we are off. That's for Pinchas. So we'll send the essay, but be sad not to get to read and discuss it together. I'm away for the week. And then the following week, after July 4th, we should be back to our regularly scheduled Monday night for Matot Maseh for the final Parashah of the book of Bamidbar and our final Parsha learning for until the fall. So great to be together again. I'll send the reminder, but we're off next week, and then the following week back on Monday, the 6th at 9 o'clock. Take care, everybody. Great rest of the week. Love to mom and dad. Good night to all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.
Bye. Don't forget to send me any suggestions about people you would like to, modern Parshanim you'd like to use for next year's Reshit Shmot by Yekren Bamidbar. Happy to take suggestions. Bye bye.
Thank you.